o'clock Pacific Standard Time. You're here with your main host, MMA coach John Hackleman, and co-host me, Angelo Ferrer, as we discuss, is the UFC a monopoly? There's a lot of talk about the UFC fighter pay and if the UFC is a monopoly in the martial arts world. And today we're going to go over that and some ripples going on within the entire MMA community. With that being said, welcome Zen Baron to another stream. So far, our first person's already logged in watching. I'll let you take it away from here, John.
Hey guys, well, this is what I mean. We're gonna go on different avenues, but basically, is the UFC a monopoly? Isn't the technical? Is not the legal term, because I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say whether it is or isn't. But I do kind of know what's fair and what's not fair. So the people that usually are complaining about the UFC being a monopoly usually aren't a monopoly themselves, and they want to be a monopoly. So it's, of course you're going to strike out at the person that's higher on the food chain, right? Whether that be money or fame or popularity. I don't know exactly what, but I mean, I hear so many things about fighter pay. Okay, now, first of all, before we get too far into it, people have actually had the stupidity to say, "Oh, you don't care about the fighter's pay. How dare you? You don't care about it." You have to understand. Do you think I care about my own fucking pay? Of course I do. I get a percentage of what they get. So of course I want them to get more money, because guess what? When they get more money, I get more money. So I want the fighters to make as much as possible. But you can't make as much as possible or as much as you think you're worth when you're fucking not worth it. If you're not worth it, if they're not willing to pay you for it. Right? I mean, it's the same in acting or football or baseball or CEOs. I mean, yeah, sure. There's probably some nepotism, right? Parent, some family, etc. But that doesn't go on in the UFC. It's people that the UFC feels is worth the most, and they pay them what they think they're worth. That's what they're worth. If they're worth more, then they could get more. But they can't get more because that's what they're worth. You know what I mean? It's like you're worth what they're willing to pay you. I mean, if you go in and work at Walmart as a greeter, how much are you worth? I mean, you might complain and say you're worth $1 million a year, but I bet you won't get it because you're probably, to Walmart, you're not worth it. Now, if you're the CEO of Walmart and you brought them in millions and millions of dollars, you'd probably be worth more money. So that's one thing. And the other thing that kind of bothers me is the people that say they don't make enough money and there's not enough benefits and there should be a union, they're only directing it towards the UFC. So if you're not making enough money in the UFC, and you don't like it, fucking leave and go find Bellator. Maybe you can get paid more there. Maybe the PFL, maybe one. I heard one pays a lot. I don't hear people complaining about it though. So I don't know. I have a problem with it. I think it's just people. I think the people that are doing that are bitter for some reason, because you're not going to see the high paid ones or the ones that are paid what they think they're worth. They're probably not complaining. And if people really complained, it's easy just to go to Bellator. I don't hear people complaining about fighter pay. Bellator doesn't pay me enough. Fighter pay. Tachi Palace doesn't pay me enough. You know what I mean? It's always fighter pay. We need more money. Dana. It's usually directed at Dana. You know what I mean? Because he's a strong personality. He's an easy one to pick on. So I don't really understand it. I think everybody gets paid what they're worth. And if you're not getting paid it's because you're not worth it. Because if you were worth it, they'd pay it to you. I don't know. That's just what I think. What do you think?
All right. So here's before we get started, let's work our way back a little bit. So according to an economic website, Investopedia, their definition of a monopoly is a market structure where a singular seller or producer assumes a dominant position in an industry or sector. Monopolies are discouraged in free market economies as they stifle competition and limit subsidies for consumers. So a monopoly structure that consists of only one seller or producer. A monopoly limits available substitutes for its product and creates barriers. So let's just go through this checklist and see if the UFC fits some of these definitions before we even go there. So like a monopoly, so let's just say for the first one, a monopoly is a market structure which a single seller or producer assumes a dominant position. Well, the UFC does check this. They are I would argue, in the dominant position in the industry and market sector of MMA. That's one check. But then the next one is a monopoly is a market structure that consists of only one seller or producer, and that's not true. That's not what's happening. Like you just mentioned, you have Bellator, you have one championship. There are other, and this is just the ones that we know of, like the PFL. Yeah. These are just the ones that we know of that are actually on TV. There's also a whole mess of smaller, as you call them, smokers, smoker venues. There's also a lot more companies, MMA promotions. It's not like the UFC has a monopoly on MMA promotions across the United States or across the world. They just happen to have the biggest one, the most known. And that's not exactly checking off this part of the monopoly checklist. A monopoly limits available substitutes for its product and creates barriers for competitors to enter the marketplace. Again, there was a little bit of that happening a long time ago when they bought out Pride. People were arguing that when they bought out Pride, they were buying out their competition, but they only bought out Pride in a few smaller venues. And they also gave opportunities for those fighters to come into the UFC cards. So it wasn't exactly like, and then Pride was going out anyway. Like, no offense to anyone. I loved Pride. I was a big fan of it back in the day. But money-wise, Pride was having issues. That's why it got bought out. It wasn't like they were buying out their only competition. There was a lot of competition to buy out, but Pride was on its way out for a lot of reasons. Out here in Japan, MMA was not as big as and when I got here, it was already fizzled out. Like, people don't know what MMA is anymore. Back then, it kind of did because of Pride. And if you talk to anybody from that generation, they'll talk about MMA and Pride, right? But now, you talk to people like I cross train with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu guys, and you mention MMA, and they mention completely different venues. The older guys mention Pride. The newer generation, some of them will mention UFC in Japan. A lot of it's one championship and Risen. Have you heard of Risen?
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of Risen. That's talked about a lot. So the two top promotions in Japan, from a Japanese perspective, whenever I talk about MMA, they'll bring up Risen and One, mostly Risen. Like, I'll come into the gym and they'll be like, "Hey, did you watch this Risen fight?" And I'm like, "No," because I really have time to watch UFC fights. I really have time to look at the data of. I don't have that many students, but when my guys are getting ready for a fight, I barely have time to keep up with that, let alone keep up with with the rest of the world. I have a hard time personally. But again, that's what they're talking about. So again, for our checklist on the monopoly, it's not like they have a corner in the market, right? Monopolies can lead to unfair consumer practices. Well, this is arguable, and we'll get to that later, but I still want to argue that the UFC does not check this box, mostly because the fighters can go somewhere else if they want to. And you see that, right? You see that. This brings me to my next point. When you look at the articles coming out there right now isn't Francis, and I'm going to mess up his last name, Naganos? Is that it?
Yeah.
Is it Naganos?
Nagano. Yeah.
He just took out a boxing match, right? Or he's going to take out a boxing match with Tyson Fury. So again, this is and he's getting paid great money for this. So it's not like he couldn't, right? Like, it's not like if he was in a monopoly, he wouldn't have that opportunity. There'd be something in the contract that said that you can't go do that at all. And if you were to do that, you have to give money back to the UFC. Nothing like, so far, it's not checking that part.
But even if it did check that box, then is your landlord a monopoly? Because you got to check that box. You got to, if you go somewhere else and pay someone else rent and break the contract, you got to buy yourself out of that lease. So is that a monopoly? I mean, the fact that for every store, for every one person that goes to a neighborhood store, probably 1,000 people go to Walmart. Is that a monopoly? What about Starbucks? Is that a monopoly? I mean,
again,
it's the more well-known companies and the more successful companies are, of course, there's going to be bitter people that aren't up there. And they're the ones that are going to be yelling, it's not fair. We want more money. It's a monopoly. That's an easy word to say, a good word to say, because then it makes the person that's higher up than you, makes them look like the bad guy. And it's not fair. But in reality, anyone that makes it to the top, they're a monopoly, right? They're a monopoly. I mean, because they're getting the most money. They're getting the most. And the reason, like, for guys to say you can't go anywhere, you sign a contract, just like you sign a lease. You know what I mean? When you sign a contract, you abide by the contract legally. So if everyone signs a contract in MMA, is every one of them a monopoly? I don't know. I don't buy it. I'm not buying it.
Then again, I'm just going off of what economists define as a monopoly. Someone being on the top is not a monopoly. There's plenty of people that can be on top. The only time it's a monopoly when they're the sole provider of whatever that is. And so it's really hard. It's really difficult to actually have a true monopoly under that definition. The other thing,
Walmart would be more than the UFC. I mean, because if you look at the One, Risen, PFL, Bellator, and then you have Walmart. What's as close to Walmart as a store, as close as all those MMA promotions are? They're a lot closer together than any store and Walmart, or any coffee shop and Starbucks. So they're much more monopolies from the outside looking in anyway, right?
Yeah, like what I think it was Roundup, the company Roundup. Almost they've been dodging a similar lawsuit because they created that seed that keeps your plants from being, it's rather than spraying pesticides, it's like an actual seed where you can grow it where the bugs don't get on your plants. But what they didn't factor in was that birds can come in and grab those seeds and dump them into other plots of land. So now Roundup was growing up to farmers that did not buy those seeds and started suing them, saying, hey, you have our seeds in your farm. And they'd check they do an inspection of the farm and find their product there without them being paid for it. And that was looking more like a monopoly. And that was much more of a monopoly. It was an unintended monopoly, but it became a monopoly because they couldn't control where the product was being grown. And people that didn't even buy the product, that's a patented product, ended up showing up in other farmers that didn't buy for it. And there was like a big lawsuit into that. So even under those circumstances, if they can get away with that, the UFC is not doing anything close to that. Like, they're not, right? They're not coming in they're not going in and suing other promotions or taking fighters from or taking over other promotions completely in that fashion at all. They are making a lot of money, but I mean, otherwise than that, like, again, I think that's the problem. People say monopoly, they'll throw that word out there and not really know what it means. Because our last one here is a monopoly. Some monopolies, such as those of the utility sector, are government regulated. So that comes to our last point. It doesn't check that box. The government has no regulation over how the UFC runs its stuff. Like, it's a private company. So it's not like it's a government ran entity. That would be the last checkpoint to try to get it to be a monopoly. So I don't.
So that's the monopoly. That's okay. So that's that. But what about, okay, and then they talk about unions, and they talk about fighter pay. So there's two big ones right there. I mean, unions are, I mean, we see how unions work. I mean, it's a communist. It's a communist idea, which is it's from what I've seen in unions is unions make sure that their people get paid more than they're worth on the outside, in the market, on the outside. So, like, for instance, the guys that work on the road, I mean, they hold the sign, right? Stop, and then they turn it, and then it says slow. I mean, they make probably as much as a registered nurse, but they're union. You know what I mean? You can't touch them because they're union. I mean, cops have unions, some nurses have unions, and usually the union people get paid the most. But then the unions get a big cut too. So it's kind of, so you got to pay your people more, you got to pay your employees more, but then your employees have to pay the union. So it's a scam. It's basically a scam, and and then there's a fighter, and then there's the fighter pay, and if the UFC doesn't pay their fighters enough, then they have the right to go somewhere else, go to Bellator. I mean, nobody says fighter pay, we want to sue Bellator. No, we don't. We never hear that, even though UFC makes more. So you only hear, I'm going to sue for fighter pay directed at UFC. You only hear about unions and medical directed at the UFC. So if they want to do that and have all promotions pay medical, unions, and fighter pay minimums, then that should be every single promotion or none. If you only single out the one you don't like because you don't like Dana, then that's just fucking not fair, right? I mean, it's not fair at all.
And you were talking
That's
about,
just my opinion.
and you were talking about how some of the fighters that complain, who they are and what they do. So one of the fighters that complained was here. I'm going to bring this up so people can see a picture of him real quick. Share screen here. One of the fighters that complained was Demetrius Johnson, also known as Mighty Mouse, and he was talking about how when he fought Dominic Cruz, he was on a contract. How much money he made was like 20 grand, and then as he moved his way up, he got like 30 grand. And I finally got a new contract as a champion. I think it was $125,000 to show and $50,000 to win, but I couldn't get the pay-per-view points. And that's where a champion makes the most bang for their buck. Because if you get on a card with Conor McGregor, then he gets 1 million buys. And if you do the math, you're going to make a shit ton of money if you had a bigger name. So he was challenging the idea that depending on the kind of numbers you draw, it's not really based on your performance as much as it's based on public appearance and how much they know who you are, right? Demetrius.
No, it's simple. It depends on who the people are want to see the most, who the people are the most, willing to pay. So that's any sport. That's boxing. That's kickboxing. It's not always the best fighter. It's the people who's going to pay the most. So why would any promotion be as bad business enough to pay someone who's much better than this guy, who this guy brings in more money? They're going to pay more whoever brings in the most money. So how would anybody say, well, I didn't bring as much money as Conor, but I should have been paid as much? How does that equate? How does that equate?
I think it's because, they're the ones stepping in and taking the risk to take punches to the head, right? So like when
Conor's not.
They're both doing the same. They're both doing the same thing. They're both doing the same thing, right?
Right.
And they're both champions.
Right.
But in some of the cases, even when they're not champions, at this point, Conor is not a champion. But I bet if he stepped in and took a fight, he can still bring in a bigger draw.
Because he can bring in a bigger
recognition,
draw.
because of his name recognition alone. So it may not actually be based on a more talented fighter.
And it shouldn't.
It's based more on their name.
Right, and that's the way it should be, right? I mean, if you're an actor and you might not be the best actor who went to acting school or whatever, but if you were the more famous actor, right, you're the biggest high, A-list. Not all the best, the A-list actors are the best actors. They're just the ones that everyone wants to buy tickets and watch them act, right? I mean, it's who brings in the most money will get the most money. If that's not as common, like that's just the most basic thing you can do. And I would rather pay any day. I'd rather pay to watch Mighty Mouse any day than Conor. I would pay. It wouldn't even be close. I would pay $100 to watch Mighty Mouse before I'd pay $10 to watch Conor McGregor. But if the majority of people didn't, and they don't follow, they don't believe, they don't do that like I would, then that's where you have to go, because the money's not going to be there if the people aren't as popular. So it has nothing to do. Well, it does have something to do, but not the money part. Who's the better fighter is who sells the most tickets. How can it be anything but that? If it's to be, if it's going to be a business, which they want it to be a business when they want their paycheck, I bet. But then you have to bring in the most money. Just like if you want to fight for Tachi Palace, you might get 1,500 to show, maybe 1,000 to win. So you can't demand them to pay, a couple mil like the UFC will. So is Tachi Palace bad because they won't pay as much as the UFC? You know what I mean? You can't make them. So why do you think you can make the UFC pay what they don't think you're worth? It's stupidity.
And then John Cox asks, should fighters' pay be set to a percentage of the pay-per-view?
That's the simplest question in the world. If they can negotiate that in their contract, yes. If they can't, then maybe the promoter doesn't think you're worth that. So they're not going to. All the high-end ones do. All of the high-end ones do. So if you're not as good yet, or you haven't brought in the crowd yet, or you're not as fun to watch or whatever, you're not going to. So you should get a cut of the pay-per-view if you have that negotiated in your contract. If you don't, then you should get a new manager before you start putting down the UFC. Right?
So much for main events down the card, says John Cox. So going off that, a lot of people have been firing off because they see blood in the water, and we only have 3 minutes. And I have to be as quick as possible about this because I got to run 6 miles before my doctor's appointment. But so the head of one, and I'm gonna mess up this. I hope this guy doesn't watch our show because I'm gonna mess up his name real good right now. So it says here, Chatri Sinyadong. That's probably so fucked up. Yeah, he's the guy who runs one championship, and his claim was that the UFC is full of sloppy, mediocre striking. Was his argument, and then he goes on to talk about how his fighters are all former Muay Thai kickboxing champions from Lumping Boxing Stadium. So a lot of his guys are coming from there. And when he looks at the UFC roster, he says your typical UFC fighter is a D1 college wrestler with a 7-0 in the minor leagues, and then they do a little bit of striking and they can get into the UFC. Well, he's got a little bit of a stricter regulation about who gets in. He says that though, but then he also signed up Demetrius Johnson. So he gets fighters that are leaving the UFC. So I'm not sure where that argument is going.
Well, it's an argument that's if his fighters are that much more entertaining, that much better, then he's just going to make a shit ton more money. And guess what? There's going to be another group of people soon suing him because they're going to want more money out of him. So, and if he pays them enough, if he pays them a lot more than UFC, all the fighters will go to him and UFC won't have any more. So if he's really that much better, his fighters are that much better, then he's going to start rising to the top. And poor Dana, he won't have any fighters, right? I don't think it's going to be that way because I think Dana is a target. I think Dana is an easy target because he talks a lot and he's outspoken. But if this guy's fighters are that much better, then pay them what they're worth. And then when people find out how much he's paying, all the fighters will go to one championship. And then Dana, the UFC won't be doing so well. And then I guarantee you, because people only want to sue the biggest, deepest pockets, right? Then all these guys are going to get in line over there and say, well, we want fighters union, we want medical, and we want a pay increase. So good for him if he has that much better fighters, but there's going to be a downside to that, is because once he's number one, everybody's going to come looking for him.
All right. And before we wrap up, John says, well, one can't tell a story. And that's true. I mean, no offense to one. If UFC does a great job of really getting their fighters' history out there. Like whenever there's a fight, they talk about how they got there. And even when they're coming up and they're not a champion yet, they do a great job of breaking that down. Well,
and that's one reason. That's one reason when people try to compare boxing with the UFC and boxing's this, they make this, and it's a whole different platform. It's a whole different dynamic. Boxing is just one guy promoting fights, and you go to different promoters. The UFC is the package. It's the package. It's the brand. The boxing, the fighter is the brand. In the UFC is the brand. So in it, when you go in the UFC, you have already a self-made advertising marketing blitz. They're spending millions and millions and millions on not only the show itself and how well it's put out, but also the marketing. They don't do that in the boxing, right? So it's more about the boxers, and it's easy. There's much less of them, right? Look how many UFC has like 500 on the roster. You know what I mean? There's not that many pro boxers. So the small amount of boxers that are really up there, they're going to make a shit ton. But in MMA, that's spread out among a lot more people.
All right. Well, our 30 minutes are up. So I think we covered it pretty well. I think we did good. We didn't get too sidetracked. We're getting better. I think we're getting better.
Let's find out if we're good enough so people start watching us more.
Hopefully we don't get sued.
Yeah, or maybe we should sue you know what? I should go sue DC, right? Because more people watch his videos than ours. So that must be unfair, right? Because if somebody's watching more than ours, that means it's unfair, and they probably have a monopoly.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us every week. Don't let anyone take your lunch money on the Live Clean and Fight Dirty live YouTube channel show. 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time every Wednesday.
Every Wednesday. Be here. See you guys.